Clary. Good evening. Thank you so much for coming this evening. My name is Sadia Pekkanen. I am the Associate Director here at the Henry M. Jackson School of International Studies at the University of Washington. And on behalf of Director Rashad Kasaba, who unfortunately could not be with us tonight, I want to welcome you all to the Jackson School, where we have been deeply engaged with the study of Asia. Let me turn to the speaker for this evening, who is, of course, actively shaping the way that we are studying Asia at the Jackson School, and whose policy ideas are really likely to be the subject of some sort of a future dissertation at the Jackson School. It's a great privilege for me to introduce Danny Russel. Welcome. He's the Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs. Before this position, he was actually special assistant to President Obama, and also Senior Director for Asian Affairs at the National Security Council. His diplomatic career includes stints in Japan in the mid-1980s, where he was the assistant or the special assistant to Ambassador Mike Mansfield. And he went on to other top-level diplomatic positions in both Japan, Korea, in Europe, and then also back in the USA here. So I think you know he's one of the principal architects of the rebalance to Asia. And this marks, of course, U.S. engagement with the region and also colors our expectations of U.S. diplomacy with the region as well. So here in his own words, the one thing that I do want to say about him is that he is an Aikido expert. I don't know how much you know about Aikido, but this is a martial arts in which I believe you defend your positions by using the opponent's energy to your advantage and also to the advantage of the game. And I think that this Aikido diplomacy is a wonderful thing as the U.S. engages with Asia. And here to tell us a little bit about that is Danny Russel. Please join me in welcoming him to the Jackson School of International Studies. Thank you.
Thank you, Sadia. Thank you, everybody. I hope you can hear me. I appreciate the chance to meet with you. I don't get to stop very often in my transits from Washington, D.C. to the region. Normally, the closest I come is overflying on a Boeing jet, drinking Seattle Best coffee, reading NBR's Asia policy, checking out the Amazon website on a Windows laptop. So I'm virtually in Seattle. Now I get to actually physically be in Seattle, and I'm happy to be here, in part because something that I have learned and that is easy to see with a president who himself hails from the Pacific region, Hawaii, in the case of President Obama, we're very much a Pacific country, and our future is inextricably linked to the Asia-Pacific region. I make it a point when I'm in Washington every couple of months to meet with every incoming class of new State Department Foreign Service officers. And I always tell them that this business that we're in, the business of diplomacy, is not a spectator sport, it's a contact sport. You got to get in there, you have to meet with government officials, you got to go out to the universities, talk to students, talk to professors, challenge the conventional wisdom, you got to break bread with business leaders, you have to talk to the dissidents, you've got to find out what's going on outside of the capitals, and also test to see if your message, your logic, plays in Pohnpei or in Phnom Penh. So, for that matter, I'm going to find out whether it plays in Seattle. What I'd like to do is to give you kind of a tour of my world. A big part of diplomacy is handling high-level visits. And I thought that maybe talking a little bit about the leaders' engagement that's scheduled for just this year, for 2015, would be a good way to take a peek into our Asia policy and what's going on and what we're trying to do. There are going to be at least four Asian leaders who come to Washington to meet with President Obama. They're returning visits that he made to Japan and to the Republic of Korea, to Indonesia, and to China just last year. And then later in the fall, he's going to return to Malaysia and to the Philippines for some meetings. And these kinds of visits touch on every aspect of our relations with the region, from increasing trade and investment to maintaining peace and stability to advancing human rights. They're issues that matter to Seattle's economy, to the American economy, and to all of us, whether we are in the middle of a career or wrapping up an academic stint, or whether we're NGOs or foundation or other parts of civil society. I think also the visits themselves reflect the effectiveness of the Obama administration rebalance to Asia policy. Because it's created what I call a new normal of closer relations with the important countries across the region through sustained and really intensive government-wide partnership. Let me start in what is really just the most fascinating and dynamic region, I'd argue, of the world, Southeast Asia. And let me start also within Southeast Asia with an incredibly important emerging power, the fourth most populous country on planet Earth, the third largest democracy in the world, the single largest Muslim majority country, Indonesia. When our president was a kid going to school in Jakarta, Indonesia's new president, Jokowi, was also growing up in the same island, in a different part. And by age 12, Joko Widodo, or Jokowi as he's now known, started putting himself through school and built an impressive small furniture business. And in his own way, like President Obama, he rose from these very, very humble beginnings to the pinnacle of leadership. And what's important, I don't have to tell you what's important about an African-American being elected President of the United States, but what's important about the rise of Jokowi is that he's not a creature of the establishment. He's not from one of the 400 wealthy Indonesian families. He's an outsider. This is today, Indonesia, a democratic system that will allow an outsider, didn't come through the military, didn't come through the oligarchy, to gain real political power. And it reflects that Indonesia, with American support over the years, has made incredible progress on democratization, on clean, good governance. And that's part of what's helped to make it one of the fastest growing economies in the world. It's also led to a real strengthening in the ties between Indonesia and the United States. And that's true on the national level. It's true on the regional level. We call it subnational level. I think Seattle and Surabaya, for example, are sister cities. I know that there are Indonesian students here at UW. And our great ambassador to Indonesia, Bob Blake, who I saw on Friday in Washington, told me that he had stopped in Seattle in part because there's about 130 Indonesian students studying science, technology, and engineering at Shoreline Community College just across the town. I know you've got cultural festivals and so on. That's really important because whether you're in Seattle or whether you're in Jakarta, the fact is that students, hosts, people learn from each other. And what we learn and the friendships that we build make a difference, and make a significant difference over time. You may not know how when you start as an exchange student or as a host or even just as a friend, but somewhere, somehow, further down the road, you and a friend and a partner from another country, whether it's in business or politics or academia or any other field, you'll find that that relationship across the Pacific really makes a difference. You'll find that you've got somebody with a different perspective and somebody that you can call on for help. Maybe you wind up doing work that ultimately helps save an endangered species, or maybe you wind up doing work that creates jobs that revive a small town. The point is, whatever it is, these are the connections that strengthen international relations and that helps the countries get closer as a result. And it's not just true for Indonesia, of course. You, I know, at the Jackson School have many students from all over Asia, from China, Japan, Korea, Taiwan. And something that I'm seeing is that as the living standards are growing and the middle class is increasing, as it is very dramatically throughout the Asia-Pacific region, there is both the capacity and the incentive for more and more students to come to America, and that's something that we should definitely welcome. I know that the APEC Forum and the Evans School now has an internship stipend that they offer to students from the Asia-Pacific region. Maybe that's something that some of you know about or even are benefiting from. The point is that you don't need to be a diplomat to make connections with people from overseas, and particularly from the Asia-Pacific region. And these connections are hugely important. I can attest as a diplomat, we've got another great diplomat, Mike Mahalik, in the room, a good friend of mine. We're in the people business. And the connections between countries ultimately are connections among people. And refreshing and expanding those connections are important, not only for tethering countries together, but also for developing in ourselves the capacity to see issues and see ourselves from somebody else's perspective. There's another country in Southeast Asia that is tremendously important, that's a youthful country with a rapidly growing middle class that's sending a growing number of students to the United States year after year after year, and that's Malaysia. It was hard even for me to believe, although I do remember the bad old era of former Prime Minister Mahathir and a lot of anti-Americanism coming out of Malaysia, but it was a shock to me when I was working at the National Security Council to discover that no American president had visited Malaysia since Lyndon Johnson. And last year, when President Obama went to Malaysia, it had been something like 48 years since that previous visit. This year, 2015, Obama's going back. 2 visits in 2 years. Why the turnaround? Well, there are a couple of reasons. One important reason is that Malaysia is an increasingly close partner to the United States in a lot of areas, in economic terms, in security terms, and elsewhere. Another reason is that Malaysia this year, 2015, has the rotating chairmanship of the group of 10 Southeast Asian countries, ASEAN. And that's an institution that matters a lot to us. And I'll come back to that in a minute. But just as on the bilateral basis, Malaysia matters to us for a lot of reasons. One, because of its strategic geographic location. You've heard of the Malacca Straits. Malaysia sits along vital sea lanes and Of course, it's surrounded by bigger and tougher and important neighbors. It's a Muslim majority country. It's a country, though, that has worked hard to forge a tolerant and a moderate, a multi-ethnic, multicultural national identity. Now, that identity is under strain, but it's a fundamental tenet of Malaysia's political culture. Malaysia has also developed, particularly in the last decade, a tremendously robust economy and has become a leader, political and economic leader in Southeast Asia, and has opened itself up to the world in an important way. Today, the U.S. and Malaysia are cooperating on a tremendous range of issues, from education and science to countering terrorism and combating violent extremism and radical jihadism. We're working on keeping the sea lanes safe and the ports safe from proliferation, the banking system safe. And Malaysia is a negotiating partner in the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership trade deal, which I'll also talk about. But as I mentioned, Malaysia, and this is true not only of Malaysia but of the countries in the region, are facing a lot of strain from internal political forces. They have trouble dealing with political dissent. And we have seen things like the jailing of the opposition leader Anwar Ibrahim, who I met with just 6 weeks ago when I was in Kuala Lumpur. And they have increasing restrictions on the press and on freedom of expression that are very troubling to us. Now, what you should know is that these are issues and problems that we don't paper over. We don't do Cold War deals where we'll turn a blind eye to the problems. But by the same token, we are not unthinkingly moralistic either in our diplomacy and our relationship. We don't agree to disagree because we think that these values of freedom and human rights are universal values. They're not unique to the United States. It's not just a matter of opinion whether citizens should have the right and the ability to select their leaders, or it's not just a matter of opinion whether people should be allowed to freely express their views. But whether it is Burma or Brunei or Cambodia or Vietnam or Thailand or China, we engage and we debate and we discuss and we argue and contest our vision for what a healthy and stable society looks like and what the essential ingredients there have to be. It's not only a dialogue about the behavior or the actions that we find problematic. It's not just about what we are against, it's what we're for. And we're for policies and practices that allow governments to unlock the potential in their citizens, to develop the human capacity that allows them to grow both economically and politically. These are not two different things. Creating space for debate, the scientific method, challenging orthodoxy, testing hypotheses, creating space for dissent. That's the root of creativity. That's also the root of competition. And creativity and competition, innovation, dissent, these are as critical in the marketplace, whether it's the marketplace of goods or the marketplace of ideas, as they are in the classroom. So we approach countries and problems as a friend with a view to succeed, not, as I said, in a hectoring, moralistic way. But to be credible, to be credible when we make these arguments, to be credible when we advocate and champion for universal rights and for the causes of dissent. We got to be there. We have to be present and accounted for in a meaningful way in the region. That means diplomatically, that means economically, but it also means being there as a partner and as a helper. We help on issues like education. We help on issues like food security, water security, environmental protection, clean water. It's not just finger wagging. Our ambassadors, our foreign service officers advance this cause in thousands of ways, by meeting with government officials, by meeting with civil society and dissenters and human rights groups, with youth leaders. They're on the front lines of what we do, what we stand for. And I'd also add that the work of NGOs, the work of companies with solid corporate social responsibility programs, with fidelity to anti-bribery rules, these too are real agents of advocacy who persuasively show what the American brand really is. That what we believe in is not just a slogan. It is a series of tools and principles that empower people and address what we all have in common, which is a longing for justice and a determination to get access to opportunities for ourselves and for our families and our children. And there is real progress. It's something that heartens me. Burma and Vietnam, I mean, these are societies in dramatic transition. You can document it in the release of prisoners and so on. You can see it in the fact that in Cambodia, the opposition is sitting not in jail, but sitting in the parliament. You can see it in a trend of democratization and elections in the region. So there's a lot to be hopeful about. There's also a lot of work left to do. What we try to do is to be present, to offer assistance, and to engage constructively. And I hope that many of you in the room will champion those causes. There are also countries, important countries in Southeast Asia where democratic institutions have really matured and taken hold. I mentioned Indonesia. Philippines is another good example of a strong and a vibrant democracy. President Obama visited Manila last April. He's going back this November to attend the APEC leaders meeting. And the millions, I think just shy of 4 million Philippine Americans here, and hundreds of thousands of Americans who are resident in the Philippines make for a very close integration between the two countries. There was a day when the U.S. had military bases in the Philippines. That day is over, but we still have an extraordinarily close security relationship that's marked by a very innovative, creative, forward-looking, and flexible set of access agreements that allow us to work together. We've got a big trade relationship and a very strong people-to-people relationship as well. That's something that shone brightly in times of crisis when just 2 years ago, the super typhoon Haiyan hit the Philippines. I remember it well. It was accompanied by a storm surge that was really the equivalent of a tsunami that none of the disaster management people had anticipated, that devastated Tacloban and the Leyte Gulf area of the Philippines. And within hours, the disaster relief teams from the United States, both civilian and U.S. military, were in action. We launched a massive rescue operation to get fresh water, medicine, electricity, tents, blankets, equipment, medical care to the citizens of these disparate islands. I visited shortly thereafter with Secretary Clary. It was really a very powerful experience. That kind of humanitarian assistance, that capability is something that the U.S. is blessed with, in part because of the strength of the U.S. military, but fundamentally because we take that on as our mission to help friends in need. You can also see in the political scene in the Philippines an important trend that I alluded to, which is the tremendous hunger of the citizens for a say in how their own country is run. In the case of the current president of the Philippines, Benigno Aquino, who's the son of Cory Aquino, the husband of the slain human rights activist, his election was really a tremendously galvanizing event because the promise of clean governance brought out people in much the same way that the Marcos effort to steal the election did, except this was a positive agenda. They had somebody to advocate for. In the modern context, the good governance practices that, for example, the Aquino government has championed are directly tied to economic growth because they give people and companies the confidence to invest, the confidence that if I create wealth, I'll be able to keep it. And that's probably the single biggest driver of innovation and creativity there is. The Philippines also is a good launching pad for a subject that's really important to me. It's near and dear to my heart. And maybe the way to think about it is to kind of ask the question, when you think about Asia in the long term, what's the essential ingredient for maintaining stability, keeping the peace, mitigating against the risk of conflict? What is it that really does the most to enhance prosperity and balanced sustainable growth and mitigate against poverty? What does all of this? I'll tell you what it is. It's international institutional infrastructure. I see the look of horror on everybody's face. Now the lecture starts. And yes, this will be on the final exam. I mean, joking aside, it's a very dense formula. It's kind of a shame that it sounds so turgid and academic, because it represents something incredibly important. The infrastructure of regional and international institutions. What are the laws, what are the principles, what are the rules that we have developed, we've agreed to live by, that are structuring our societies and our decision-making? This is not something that fell out of the sky. These aren't the Ten Commandments. These are institutions that we collectively are developing. They're the best solutions that humanity has found for managing conflict, for managing disputes, for managing differences. And through these institutions, we've created systems, for example, on the trade side, that create millions of jobs, that bring the coffee beans to Starbucks, that bring all the Starbucks concoctions to every corner of planet Earth, that support the interconnected global system, that support telecommunications, that support air travel, that have shrunk the world, that have enriched us and the country. And importantly, it's the institutions that stand against the notion that might makes right. And I'd argue that the most extraordinary contribution that the United States made in the latter half of the 20th century was in helping to create institutions, whether it was the UN or Bretton Woods, that served the greater good, and agreeing that even we, the strongest country on earth, would be bound by the same rules that bind other countries. Now, there are plenty of exceptions that people can point to where we didn't live up to or honor our high standards, but as a general proposition, we embraced the institutions and their rules, although we could have flaunted them, and that's important. Without those institutions, we live in a world that had a lot less good Starbucks coffee and a lot more conflict and a lot more tension. When I was brought over from the State Department to the White House to work in the NSC at the beginning of 2009, the U.S. and the world was in the midst of a really serious financial crisis, the worst economic global downturn since the Great Depression. And the big difference between what I saw in 2008, 2009 and what the history books tell about 1929 and the early 30s is really the institutions and the international cooperation that helped blunt the effect of the economic crisis and turn things around. 2008 was when the G20 leaders met, and that's when the G20 came together. And that was a vehicle for coordinated action that made all the difference. This year, as the Philippines hosts APEC, and I know Seattle hosted APEC just about 4 or 5 years ago, they'll be bringing together leaders in another important institution that does a tremendous amount of work on trade, on environment, on economic growth. And then, as you see in the headlines, there's an active debate underway now about a new arrangement, the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. This is an arrangement that will add tremendously, not only to the region's multilateral framework, but to economic growth. It supports growth and high-paying jobs in the United States, and it supports growth in the Asia-Pacific region in ways that will expand the pie and create new export opportunities for us. So in shaping the 21st century, which is a business that we in the State Department are very much mindful of, we have to ask ourselves something. How can we ensure that the Asia-Pacific region will sustain the kind of open, transparent, rules-based system that's really been the foundation of the tremendous amount of growth over the last 70 years? And I think that TPP is a very big part of the answer. I'm not a trade person, and it won't take long to get beyond my level of knowledge and trade policy. I get like free trade, lower tariffs, eliminate barriers, market access, promote investment, and if you got deeper questions than that, you're gonna have to direct them to Mike in the audience. But I do know that what's extraordinary about the TPP agreement is that it is not only a trade deal. If you stripped out all of the trade provisions in the TPP and just left the environmental stuff, it would be the best, most aggressive, and enforceable environmental treaty on planet Earth. It's got provisions for protecting marine mammals and for preventing wildlife trafficking and for sustainable fisheries and penalties for illegal fisheries and for economic policies that foster bad maritime resource management. And it's got sanctions in it if they're violated. This is a really powerful environmental agreement. It's got a chapter on labor standards that could itself be just a standalone treaty on labor rights, on according freedom of assembly and the right of collective bargaining and labor to organize. It's got protections against child labor, against the kind of slavery that is being reported on in the fishing industry in Southeast Asia, including in Malaysia. It's got provisions on the internet economy that protect the 40+ and growing million jobs in the United States based on digital industry and exports, as well as protecting the free flow of data across borders, which is hugely important to all of us. It's got a chapter specifically dedicated to sustainable development and poverty alleviation. This is way more than a trade agreement. And it's also got a huge strategic significance, because the ability of the United States and the 11 other countries in the Asia Pacific, and once they finish, there'll be more in short order. The ability of these countries to come together around a rules-based but high standard, comprehensive agreement with the kinds of provisions that I've described, in addition to eliminating tariffs and barriers and opening markets and creating a level playing field for investment. It has strategic significance because it means America is in the game. It means that countries have economic choices. And that economic diversification, the ability to choose, the ability to sell to a stable and a broad market, is important in part because countries in the Asia-Pacific region don't want to be overly dependent on China. Now, TPP is not an anti-China agreement in any way, shape, or form. And I believe that the world would be a much better place if and when China were able to meet the high standards that Japan or Vietnam or Singapore or Australia or Canada or Mexico or we have to meet in order to join TPP. But we've seen, and the countries in the region have seen, instances of the use of economic retaliation and coercion, and the creation of a marketplace that constitutes something like 40% of global GDP is a huge net positive for the entire region, including for China. Now, right now, I know from talking to my colleagues in Washington that we are at the end game in the negotiations. I'm absolutely convinced that the leaders of the 12 countries are determined to bring this to a close soon this year. There's another important institution that I want to touch on. I talked about ASEAN. Built around ASEAN is something called the East Asia Summit. And shortly after taking office, President Obama decided that the United States would join the East Asia Summit, and he's made a trip every year to East Asia in order to participate in that. This year, Malaysia, as the chair of ASEAN, will host it. And it's a forum that allows for the discussion of important strategic and security issues that don't get talked about by leaders in other meetings and other forums. High on that agenda is the issue of the South China Sea. There are numerous disputed territorial claims there, and the United States isn't one of the claimants. We don't have a stake, we don't have a dog, an island in that fight. And that allows us to be principled, and it allows us to be unbiased. It doesn't matter to us whose claim ultimately is demonstrated to be the legally credible claim. It doesn't, we don't benefit one way or the other. But we do have a huge and abiding interest in how countries pursue their claims. It can't be simply me want, me take. That's not the 21st century that we want to live in. Claims have to be made in ways that are consistent with international law. And the behavior and the methodology that countries pursue has to be peaceful, it has to be diplomatic. It can be recourse to a legal institution like a tribunal. It can be bilateral or multilateral negotiation. But it can't be threats, it can't be intimidation, it can't be through the use of force. Whether the claimant is the tiny nation of Brunei or whether it's the huge nation of China shouldn't matter when it comes to resolving what is ultimately a diplomatic or a legal issue. And by creating a forum, the way that the East Asia Summit does, where leaders can talk and hash out these issues and can affirm and reaffirm the guiding principles at stake, the freedom of navigation and overflight, the right to unimpeded lawful commerce. Those institutions are critical to getting parties to work through long-term solutions. That's why international institutions are so important. Now, some of the best allies and partners that we have in strengthening these kinds of institutions are allies. And that brings me, and I should pick up the pace here, it brings me to two very important upcoming visits. First, the visit by the leader of Japan, Prime Minister Aaib, and second, the Republic of Korea, Park Geun-hye. Both are examples, both countries and both leaders are examples of countries that share a commitment to democracy, a respect for universal human rights, and a very successful track record of unlocking the kind of human potential that generates sustained prosperity. And of course, they're two of our closest partners in security terms. Prime Minister Abe's visit is going to advance our bilateral cooperation, and we're exploring some new and really creative areas. NASA in the US and JAXA in Japan, for example, jointly exploring space. We're revising our defense guidelines for the first time in 17 years to ensure that we're prepared for modern threats. We're working on protecting the environment, countering violent extremism. And the cooperation isn't just government to government, it's local as well. I know that Washington State and Miaken, for example, have collaboration on life sciences and aerospace and on IT, and that's very, very important. When Prime Minister Abe comes, he will announce breakthroughs on and progress on a whole range of issues. He'll also speak to a joint meeting of Congress, and that will be the very first time that a U.S. Congress has hosted a speech by a Japanese Prime Minister. It's significant, and what it means in a nutshell is, as an example to the world, that the bitterest of enemies can become the best and closest of friends. And it's particularly important because 2015 is such an important milestone year For one thing, it's the 70th anniversary of the end of World War II, and that includes some pretty horrible anniversaries, such as the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It's also 50 years since the normalization of relations between Japan and Korea. And that presents some delicate challenges. A year of remembrance is a year in which countries have to address the very sensitive legacy of the last century. And it's a challenge that the Japanese Prime Minister has to address. But it's not a challenge that he or any leader can meet alone. Other leaders have to help. And so later this summer, President Obama will host the Republic of Korea's president, Park Geun-hye. That's a very strong alliance, a strong relationship as well. On economic terms, the first free trade agreement that the Obama administration concluded was with Korea. It wasn't easy, but it was worth the effort. It's a phenomenal agreement, and I know that there have been huge gains for exporters, including from Seattle and Washington area. I think Seattle alone is something like $1 billion now in trade. So we not only engage bilaterally and as allies with important partners like Japan and Korea, we also engage globally. And I like to say the rebalance is going global. What that means is that we're not only cooperating with Asian countries in Asia, we're cooperating with Asian countries all over the world. And what they add is hugely important. That brings me to the last country and the final visit that I want to talk about, which is the visit of Chinese President Xi Jinping. In Xi Jinping, and he's just entering his third year, there's still a lot of debate about his style and his strategy. But what we can see is his commitment to continuing an intense pace of economic development, but adjusting to new realities in the global economic environment and in China. At the same time, we're seeing him grapple with the contradictions that are inherited in an attempt to build a 21st century economy, and that means an innovation economy, without allowing the political freedom that experience has demonstrated is critical to innovation and entrepreneurship. In looking at China and in looking at the U.S.-China relationship, we have to be very clear-eyed about our differences. And there are real differences. Talk about them, but at the same time, there's a tremendous amount that we can do together, and frankly, we're obligated to do together, because when China and the United States can agree, there is a tremendous amount that we can accomplish. And when the U.S. and China cannot agree, it often becomes quite difficult to make progress on big issues, including on big global issues. In the last year, we've made some important steps forward. One of them is the agreement to extend the validity of visas in both directions, and that directly affects students and directly affects business people. It has a very powerful and positive impact on our economic relationships as well as our people-to-people ties. We're now in the process of trying to negotiate a bilateral investment treaty that could hugely expand Chinese investment into the United States, which is a good thing, but also create protections for the extensive U.S. investment into China. The two presidents also announced a really important agreement on climate. They committed to an aggressive level of emissions reduction targets for post-2020 and the run-up to the Paris UN conference this year. We have agreed on cooperative programs on carbon capture and sequestration, on renewable energy and low-carbon green solutions to urbanization and super urbanization. And because of China's growth, the environmental issues, the food and water safety issues, and climate more broadly carries a tremendous political significance as well as an economic significance. Some of you may have seen the documentary on pollution that was run in China for a couple of days before the National People's Congress. It got something like 200 million hits in the first 2 days, but then was shut down. The Chinese Communist Party said, hey, we're in charge of talking about the environment. We're in charge of deciding who's to blame for environmental degradation. And they moved to curb this as just an example of the limits to internet freedom. This is something that we talk to the Chinese about because the solutions to challenges like the environment have to be solutions that involve the society as a whole. And you can't shut down the polluting smokestacks if you are shutting out information. A critical case in point was the early practice, and in fact, Gary Locke, the former governor of Washington State, congressman and ambassador to China, played a role in publicizing the readings of the particulate matter and air pollution in Beijing because it was something that the people in our embassy cared deeply about. How dangerous is it? There were days when the pollution level in Beijing went 500 times above what is considered to be safe in the United States. His employees, our people, wanted to know about it. We told them online, and not surprisingly, the citizens of Beijing wanted to know as well. And ultimately, because the effort to shut down the information failed, the Chinese government had no choice but to embrace it and took over their own numbering program and began putting out daily reports. That reflected an incentive that Chinese had to try to reduce the pollution itself and has led to an important shift in policy as well as in, social movement. There are other ways that we've invested through our dialogue on human rights, on Uyghurs in Xinjiang, Tibet, Hong Kong, and freedoms and universal suffrage. We don't turn a blind eye to the problem areas, but even though we know that many of these issues aren't going to be resolved in the foreseeable future, we don't give up on them. And we work to ensure that together we're making headway. An important part of the way that we do that is through high-level leaders' meetings, but that's only the tip of the iceberg. There's a great deal that falls below that, whether that is the many, many meetings of cabinet secretaries and ministers crisscrossing the Pacific between the U.S. and China, the U.S., Japan, Korea, and frankly, all of the countries in Southeast Asia, the countries in Northeast Asia, and the countries in the Pacific region, whether it's Australia, New Zealand, or little Kiribati and Fiji. That's what I mean by the new normal of our rebalance. The fact that we're engaged in a sustained way, we're engaged based on our own interests, but to the benefit of the region as a whole. And it's not just the US military, it's not just the US government, it's students, it's business people, it's scientists. We're all in this. So my bottom line is this: development, security, trade, they all go together. You don't need me to tell you how important Asia is for trade to Seattle or to Washington. What we do and what you do by way of reaching out, by way of communicating, by way of building friendships, and by way of activism, that makes a big difference. And I'd like to encourage and hopefully inspire some of you, whether it's because you are retiring and are going to have some time and resources, or whether it's because you're a student and you're trying to decide where to go, or because you're a businessman or an academic and you're working on it. Encourage you to keep pushing out the borders of our interests and these universal values. So let me stop there and see if you all have any questions. Thank you.
Please join me in thanking you for wonderful remarks. And I will open it up in just 1 second. I'd like to have the privilege of asking you the first question, and I think this is something that you were also speaking about earlier at NBR. How is U.S. engagement with the region complicated by the fact that some of our allies are joining institutions like AIIB and others are not? What does that do for U.S. engagement with the region? Because you emphasize so much the international institutional infrastructure. So, please.
Great. Well, that's a great question. I think that the issue of the AIIB, which is very much in the news, has gotten formulated as a kind of battle of the titans, a sort of zero-sum tug of war. And that's unfortunate because the reality, and certainly in my perception, is very, very different. When the Chinese started talking about doing more to promote and to fund infrastructure in Asia, our reaction was, go for it. I mean, there's a huge need for infrastructure investment in Asia, and that's all to the good. The Chinese have something on the order of $4 trillion worth of foreign exchange that they can't convert, and like, hey, put it to work. What's stopping you? Now, at the same time, they have perhaps not an admirable record in terms of the infrastructure development loans to the developing world, whether it's Sri Lanka or the Maldives or even Burma. Certainly in Africa as well, there have been any number of problems. So I think the United States, along with the bulk of the international community, was wary at the outset. Why, for example, wouldn't the Chinese want to help capitalize the Asian Development Bank? Or why not work through the IMF or the World Bank? Or for that matter, China already has a China Development Bank. So what's really this all about? What we, as the United States and our partners and friends in the industrialized world agreed on was that any new bank, if it is to in fact be a multilateral development bank, an international bank, needed to take as its starting point the good practices that have been developed for multilateral development banks over the last decades. Nobody's got an objection with a new bank, but it should be at least as good as the ones that are already out there, and hopefully better. That's kind of common sense. So when initially the Chinese, in describing the AIIB, had only very vague answers for what the governance structure would be like or what kind of standards, many of us were pretty leery and wary. And we gave one consistent message to the Chinese and one same consistent message to other countries that were looking at the Aaib, which is this. It should have good international standards. That means transparency, that means good governance, that means accountability, that means good balance so that it's not owned exclusively by the Chinese. There's no single country that can make all the decisions. It should have a resident board of directors that's credible and diverse. Like, do it the right way. That's all we have ever asked for. Now, the good news is that there has been, over the course of that 6 or 12 or 18 months, in response to that chorus, a lot of progress on the part of the Chinese. And I think that more and more clarity has been provided through articles of agreement and commitments and so on. Some countries, many countries, have felt that, all right, it's getting there. And it's heading in the right direction, and let's join and we'll work it from the inside. So be it. That's one way of looking at it. For our part, we, I know Japan, several other countries have taken the view, looking better, good progress, but the proof is in the pudding. Let's see. You won't really know how the bank operates until there is a final decision about things like a resident board and standards and review. And frankly, once you see 1 or 2 or 3 projects and how the bank operates, then you'll really know. And we're better off waiting. We encourage China to do it well. We encourage the countries that have signed up to ensure that it gets done well. And I hope that we're successful.
Thank you. So I'm glad you're not closing the door on perhaps joining the Aaib at some point down the line. Thank you. That was great. What I'd like to do is to open it up to the audience. I've seen a number of hands that I've written down. If I don't know your name, could you please introduce yourself? I'd like to start with Ken Pyle over at the back. And Ken, if you could speak loudly. If we don't hear your question, I'll try to repeat it.
Thank you,
Please.
for a fine talk. Actually, Sadia asked the question I was trying to ask. Thank. But I'm also wondering, you mentioned having the Prime Minister of Japan and the President of South Korea visit this year. And we're doing our best, I know, to encourage both countries to reconcile their history differences. I'm wondering if there's something that we ourselves could do to act as a kind of model for historical reconciliation, and that is kind of unresolved issue of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. You worked for Mike Mansfield a long time ago. He began visiting Hiroshima, and Ambassador Kennedy has as well. But isn't it time for an American president to visit there, and not necessarily to make an outright apology, but as an act of reconciliation? So I'm wondering what your thoughts on that. We, for example, we've sent over Vice President and Secretary of Defense and encouraged Prime Minister not to go to Yasukuni and so on. But how about us taking a more positive role in our own past historic role in the end of the war?
Thank you, Ken. Let me just repeat the question for the purposes of the record. The question is, can the U.S. act or have a more positive historical model that will help with reconciliation between Japan and Korea, particularly thinking about U.S. president visits to possibly Hiroshima and Nagasaki?
Well, that's a very thoughtful question. Thank you. The president himself was asked this question, and I was in the room, and he said, I would be honored to visit Hiroshima, if possible, before the end of my presidency. So I state that as a fact on the record. More broadly, with respect to the U.S. Role as a model in terms of reconciliation, yes, I agree that the challenge for America in coming to terms with things like the firebombing of Tokyo or the use of nuclear weapons on civilian targets in Hiroshima and Nagasaki are humbling reminders of really how difficult it is to fully come to terms with the events of tragic war and the degree to which politics can at times conscribe the freedom of action of a given leader. But the fact of the matter is that the United States, I believe, stands as a very powerful example of reconciliation in tandem with Japan. You know, former President George H.W. Bush used to speak from personal experience, having fought in the war against the Japanese, at the extraordinary transformation that he underwent and that he witnessed from foe to friend. I've been part of meetings of wounded veterans from Japan and the United States who have come together. I've been with them, in fact, at Pearl Harbor. Although I wasn't able to go, Ambassador Kennedy and Ambassador Sasai, the U.S. ambassador to Japan, recently traveled to Iwo Jima to commemorate the brutal battle there 70 years ago. I agree there's more that we can do, and this is kind of an infinite challenge, but as an American, I feel proud that the relationship between the U.S. and Japan stands as such a strong model of reconciliation. There are also things that we try to do, seek to do, to advance the reconciliation between Japan and its neighbors, and specifically and importantly between Japan and the Republic of Korea. I am not suggesting that this is purely altruistic. The United States suffers strategically from friction between the two most important democracies, our two most stalwart security allies, and two of the major economies in the Asia-Pacific region. This is a bad thing for us. Look no further than North Korea and the strategic vulnerability that ensues from any restraint on trilateral U.S.-Japan ROK or bilateral Japan-Korea security cooperation against the backdrop of a menacing and ongoing nuclear weapons program and intercontinental ballistic missile program. We have a huge incentive in progress. I think that both sides recognize that the time has come for meaningful gestures and progress. It's always been my view that one party can't reconcile entirely by itself, and that as important as it is for Prime Minister Aaib and the Japanese side to send the signals and make the gestures that Japan's neighbors seek, it is equally important that Japan's neighbors signal that those gestures will be fully reciprocated and that an apology will be accepted, basically.
Thank you. Please, Don.
Yeah.
This is Don Howard from the Jackson School.
I want to return to the question that Sadia asked initially and give a different spin to it. For reasons I don't fully understand, I actually attended a meeting hosted by the Chinese Communist Party Central Committee right after President Xi was elected. The title of it was Managing an Increasingly Interdependent but Non-Convergent Global Political Economy, the Role of Emerging Countries. In that meeting, it was very clear that China was feeling its oats, that they, and this is what's important, I really totally agree with your emphasis on institutions. In the paper I wrote, quoted Jean Monnet and others stressing to their dismay, because I said they were nationalist and not multilateral and they better get figured out. But what amazes me is that, you know, they did this not because they thought they could provide better money. Of course they could do that. They did it because they are the dominant economic power in East Asia, or want to be, probably are in many respects, that they resent modest changes in voting rights they got in the IMF, and the fact that America and France run the World Bank. It was really a question of prestige for them. I have no doubt that they will figure out how to run a bank, and I think they will be. But I don't think it's wise to have them setting up separate institutions, because whether it's their intent or not, it will become what the press is making of it. And I guess my question is, how does this fit in with your notion, which is really based on convergence on the one hand and so on, with which I'm very sympathetic, but I don't see China changing, having an epiphany and becoming a democratic capitalist country like America. So we're going to have to live for 20 years with it. This may be the first such institution. I wonder why, for example, the TPP did not include China. I know the answer is that they won't do all these other things, but it strikes me as being a strange model for the future to exclude the largest country in Asia and the world.
I'm going to try and translate or summarize the question. I think it would be about really the inclusion of China and its ability to create international institutions and the role that we expect the United States to play in that particular process.
Well, I very, very much agree with your comments, and I therefore think they're insightful. The Chinese president has said, subsequent to the 18th Party Congress in a number of occasions, that he is pursuing a China dream. And that China dream is a Sinocentric system that frankly bears a striking resemblance to the old Imperial model of subordinate, compliant, tributary states on China's periphery that accept China's suzerainty in return for gifts and largesse. That's the model of the 16th century. It's not the model of the 21st century. But that doesn't for a moment suggest that we want to deny China its dream of moving its 1.3, soon to be 4 billion people into the middle class, or its dream of creating a healthy, stable, coherent, and vibrant society. We want that. In part, we want it because the alternative is so frightening and so adverse to our interests. The effort that we're engaged in is to convince China's leaders, that the existing international rules-based order is, number one, not adverse to China's interests. After all, it's responsible in large part for China's success over the last 30, 35 years. Secondly, that the status quo is not locked, that the rules can be changed, and that China can have an important say, even a decisive say, in revising the rules, but that that revision of the rules has to be through a consensual process, and that China can't simply ignore or run roughshod over the rules merely because it can. And that includes discouraging China from wantonly or gratuitously recreating institutions, including financial institutions, simply to have them headquartered in Beijing or made in China. That's not our first choice. But we're not dedicated to preventing it as a matter of principle. We'd like to see China using and helping to adjust the institutions that exist. The Chinese may have a very legitimate beef in the slowness of the other multilateral development banks, such as the Aaib, to adjust to the changing reality of China's size. So that may be a fair complaint, and perhaps we've learned something from this. Going forward, it is certainly our view that the Aaib should cooperate fully with the Aaib. Now that it exists, let's try to make it not only a good institution in its own right, but also one that is complementary to and collaborative with the existing institutions and structures. That's what I'm saying. I think that it is a very misleading misnomer to talk about excluding China from TPP. It's simply not true. Nobody is excluded. This is an agreement that began with 4 countries, that grew to 9 countries, and then with the inclusion fairly late in the game of Mexico, Canada, and Japan, became 12 countries who made a commitment among themselves to hammer out an agreement that would have the attribute of tremendously high standards, unprecedented high standards, and ambition. And I described for you in my remarks some of the non-trade elements that are unprecedented, really extraordinary. On the trade side, it's also very impressive because it is an agreement that sets out to significantly reduce and eliminate tariffs and barriers, including non-tariff barriers, and create genuinely free markets. Which countries are willing to do that? They're few and far between, and China ain't one. Now, any country, or for that, as far as I'm concerned, economy, that is willing, once we, the 12, have gotten this done later this year, any country or economy that is willing to try and that can convince each of the TPP members that it's serious is a candidate. The Koreans have signaled they're interested. The Philippines have signaled they're interested. The Taiwan has signaled it's interested. There are many other prospective members of TPP. It's up to China. Now, I think that China, by virtue of both its economic structures, its heavy reliance on state-owned enterprises, its closed character, so I mean, China's got a phenomenal distance to go. And unlike Vietnam, which is also a one-party communist state, just the size and scale of China's economy is so mammoth that it's a pretty daunting proposition. What we didn't want to do, although we could have, was pursue another mediocre trade deal. We don't have an objection to things like the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, that China and most of the ASEAN and many of the Southeast Asian countries are discussing. Japan is part of that. There's no contradiction. People can do it. But that leaves us cold. You know, you want it bad, you get it bad. just to have a free trade agreement, number one, that's not what we want. Number two, we could never get it through Congress.
Scott Lumpkin, he's also from the Jackson School.
I wanted to thank you for speaking. I found it not only interesting and illuminating, but somewhat revealing. Now I can go home and challenge the inviolable authority of CNN and a few other organizations based on your expertise. I actually have a fairly specific question. To go back to the movie you mentioned, Under the Dome, it's called, and it's available on YouTube now, both in a total file and as 8 separate portions. But it's a very striking movie, and very powerful, and very skillfully put together. Great production values by a very complex filmmaker. So that young woman telling the story of her daughter and the impact of not wanting to bring her daughter up in a land that's poisonous, essentially. Very effective. But what occurs to me, and what some of the people I know in China and in the State Department or the Department of Energy have been suggesting is that China's energy future is going to be much more heavily dependent on nuclear power than we think. Right now, they have a planned total build fleet of about 210 reactors. That's about more than twice what the U.S. has, the largest, and about half of what the fleet is in the world today. But there are spokesmen, let me put it that way, who discuss the possibility that it being twice that size. In other words, China alone having essentially the fleet of nuclear reactors, the number that exists today in the world, in 31 countries. And therefore, if this is possible, this sets a whole new precedent for a very different kind of future regarding nuclear power. China's been very successful with this so far, and they're not quite called the gold standard yet, but they seem to be moving ahead. And I wanted to ask you if you had heard similar things. The way your head was nodding, it suggests that you had.
So the question is about the development of nuclear power reactors in China and where you think that is headed related to environmental concerns.
Yeah, the Chinese government has spoken to us at length in numerous fora about their energy mix strategy, and is very eager to get access to American technology, including renewable energy, fracking, etc., but particularly sophisticated nuclear energy technology. Within certain limits, we are very supportive of that. Westinghouse is engaged with China in building very, very modern, state-of-the-art nuclear power reactors. I know of the existing program is to bring online something like 27 new nuclear reactors, and I can't remember offhand the aggregate number of gigabytes, but it's a phenomenal amount of energy, except when you compare it to China's growing energy needs. So in context, it's woefully insufficient and inadequate. One of the great motivators for us is the consider the alternative phenomenon, which is that China traditionally is heavily reliant on dams for hydroelectric power and on coal. And it is expensive and difficult for China to get the technology required for clean coal production. It's bringing on dozens of coal-fired plants every day. And many of the even primitive smokestack scrubbers that are donated or given by the US or Japan go unused. So it's a huge problem. And as is the environmental cost from excessive reliance on dams, as well as the social cost. So we have an incentive to assist China in advancing and realizing its plan for altering the energy mix to relieve its heavy dependence on coal. With regard to under the dome and environmental pollution, the risk we have always seen is that China would solve the proximate problem of heavy pollution in the cities by relocating smokestacks downwind, which might ameliorate the health problems in Shanghai or Beijing, but would not ameliorate the global warming problem driven by the exploding emissions rate. Automobiles are another area which, the exponential growth in China has a devastating impact on both its own environment and the world. I don't have the statistics with me, but the percentage of Chinese rivers that are poisoned, the percentage of Chinese farmland that is toxic, the rate of disease, which is directly attributable to pollution, is absolutely stunning. It's the macabre joke among the expat community in China is that it's a fantastic place to live, except that you can't drink the water, eat the food, or breathe the air.
Thank you. We have time for one more question. Can I take this right here? Please, can you tell me who you are and...
So I'm Trung from the daily newspaper in Vietnam. I would like to ask Mr. Daniel Russel about the rebalance of the United States Asia. So recently, a U.S. Navy top official has said China is building a great wall of sand in South China Sea. And does it affect the United States rebalance to Asia? And is there any solution to enforce China to follow the international laws? Thank you.
Thank you. So the question is about the South China Sea and what the United States, how that figures into the U.S. rebalance to the region and China's commitment to the rule of law.
Well, specifically, you're referring to a comment by a dear friend and colleague of mine, Admiral Harry Harris, who was speaking about the large-scale reclamation work, the dredging of sand and earth from the sea bottom to fill in gaps between rocks and submerged shoals to create artificial islands in the Spratlys in the South China Sea. This work has been underway for approximately a year and a half at a breakneck pace that I think the world has never seen. And in a very short period of time, the Chinese have dredged and reclaimed acreage that is on the order of 500 or 600 acres. And that compares to maybe 3 or 4 acres of reclaimed land that, for example, Vietnam, another claimant in the Spratlys, did over the course of 10 years. So there's no comparison. The order of magnitude is vastly different. This is a topic that I have discussed in my diplomatic meetings that senior officials, including the Secretary of State, have raised repeatedly with the Chinese in an effort to gain more clarity about the intent and the purpose of creating these artificial islands. Now, some of them are in, they're all in waters that are disputed and that are the subject of significant differences between among the claimants between China and Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, the Philippines, and Taiwan has its own claims. And as I said earlier, the U.S. doesn't. Now, under international law, including the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which China is a signatory to and is bound by, you cannot create an island and then claim it as a land feature. You can't build something in the sea and say, this is my sovereign territory, and so I get 12 nautical miles of territorial water, or I get 200 miles of exclusive economic zone, EEZ. That's illegal. And so at one level, China can build all the islands it wants. It doesn't affect its claim to the South China Sea in any way. It doesn't help. From the U.S. point of view, what is China going to do? Is China going to build these into military bases? That's not a good thing, but the U.S. doesn't stop the U.S. Navy from sailing wherever we want. It doesn't stop the U.S. military from operating. But here's what it does do. It gives neighbors like Vietnam, like Malaysia, like Indonesia, like the Philippines, real concern about China's intention. What is China's intention? Why does a neighbor behave this way? Now, the Chinese claim that, among many claims, that these islands or outposts are simply for shelter by fishermen and for, in case of an emergency, they can be used for disaster relief. Well, there are many ways that the Chinese, if that is the purpose, could reassure neighbors about their benign intent. They could make those outposts available to any fisherman. They could invite partners in ASEAN to use them for a joint humanitarian assistance program operating out of them. They could, and I hope they will, refrain from putting in any military installations of any kind. Nobody benefits from a militarization of the very sensitive area of the South China Sea. But we have, as the United States, two top priorities that I would lift up. One is we want to see China have good, stable, peaceful relations with its neighbors. Nobody benefits from the kind of tensions that were created when the Chinese suddenly, and I would say aggressively, moved a deep-sea oil rig right off the coast of Vietnam. That's not a neighborly way to do business. No good comes of that. And the global economy is too fragile, and the regional economy is too important for that kind of risk and that kind of strain. The second priority for the United States is ensuring that everybody is adhering to accepted international rules, laws, and norms. That means freedom of navigation, freedom of overflight. That means peaceful resolution of disputes. That means respect for international dispute settlement mechanisms like the tribunal in The Hague. It's not acceptable merely to say we don't think that court is going to rule in our favor and therefore we're not bound by it. If, as China has, you have ratified and signed the UNCLOS treaty. So we're looking for answers. and we're looking for restraint.
Thank
Sorry,
you.
one more question. Last week I was called to testify before the U.S. Congress regarding the
Excuse me,
kidnapping
can
of
you
my
tell me who
son,
you are?
Mochi. I'm Jeffrey Morehouse. Regarding the kidnapping of my son, Mochi Atomu Morehouse, and 400 other American citizen children that were abducted to Japan since 1994. And I'm wondering what you will be doing on your upcoming trip with Japanese counterparts to secure the return of my child, with whom I have sole custody in the U.S. as well as Japan, as well as the other American children.
Well, I can tell and understand this is an emotional issue and a personal issue for you, and as a parent, I share it. In fact, as a parent of bicultural children, I sympathize and understand. We have worked, and I have worked hard on the issue of parental-child abduction, and am gratified that at long last Japan has signed and ratified that convention. I know also that the Japanese government is working on helping or to resolve the so-called grandfather cases, the cases that occurred before ratification of the Hague Convention, to which the convention now no longer applies. Our consular unit in our embassy in Japan is committed to working with all American citizens to try to see justice done. But I'm not familiar with any particular case.
The embassy's
Okay,
actually assured me in writing, and I'd be glad to give it to you if you'd be willing to take it afterwards, that they have submitted a formal letter of request to the Japanese government to enforce the custody order that I won there to return my son.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm sorry to
very
interrupt
much.
all.
Thank you. Please join me on behalf of the students and also the Jackson School. Let me thank you for your remarks and the wonderful way that you're continuing to engage with the region. Please join me in thanking Assistant Secretary.